Just the economy. He went on all kinds of tangents, attacking transgender Americans, talking about windmills and electric vehicles, saying that the U.S. border was now as tight as North Korea, and really launching a remarkably virulent attack on the Minnesota representative Ilhan Omar, talking about her head shawl, calling it a little turban, saying that he wanted to throw her out of the country. He also revived that derogatory term that he used during his first term in office to describe third world countries. You know, he denied using it at the time, but the president last night just came out and said, shithole countries, saying that the U.S. shouldn't take migrants from those places, and he wants more from places like Norway and Sweden. And so it was a speech that meandered in all kinds of different directions. Even when the president was talking about the economy, some of his messaging was a little off-putting when he talked about how parents didn't need to buy so many dolls and pencils for those.
So you just watched this, and if your blood isn't boiling yet, then you haven't been paying close enough attention, because what we're witnessing right now is nothing less than the systematic construction of a surveillance apparatus that would make Orwell himself weep, and the fact that we're talking about forcing tourists to hand over 5 years of their social media history under the flimsy pretext of national security is precisely the kind of authoritarian maneuver that announces itself with trumpets and expects us to stand there applauding while our freedoms burn. The Trump administration has proposed a sweeping change that would require all foreign tourists to disclose up to 5 years of their social media history before they can travel to the United States, and before you even think about dismissing this as just another border security measure, let me tell you exactly what's coming next, because this is where it gets absolutely terrifying. We're not just talking about a minor expansion of visa requirements here. We're talking about collecting previously used telephone numbers from the last 5 years, email addresses from the last 10 years, IP addresses and metadata from electronically submitted photos, creating a digital dossier so comprehensive that every tweet you've ever sent, every protest you've attended that was documented on Instagram, every political opinion you've expressed online becomes part of a permanent government file that will determine whether you're worthy of stepping foot on American soil. And here's what should absolutely chill you to your core. The proposal would extend social media vetting to ESTA-approved countries previously exempted, including United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, which means we're not talking about some targeted enforcement against so-called high-risk nations. We're talking about subjecting millions of ordinary people from our closest allies to ideological screening that transforms the very act of entering the United States into a political loyalty test. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and this is the bombshell that should be dominating every conversation about civil liberties in this country right now. From December 15th, the department requires an online presence review for all H-1B skilled worker applicants and their H-4 dependents, on top of the students and exchange visitors already subject to the same screening, and the State Department is literally instructing all applicants for H-1B, H-4, and the FM and J student and exchange categories to switch their social media privacy settings to public HUD. Let me repeat that because it deserves to sink in. The United States government is ordering people to make their private social media accounts public, to strip away their digital privacy settings, to expose every personal conversation and political opinion to government scrutiny, or face denial of entry. This is new, it's unprecedented, and what we're watching is the normalization of state surveillance masquerading as immigration policy, except the mask is so thin that even calling it a mask feels generous. The Electronic Frontier Foundation didn't mince words when they called this a dangerous push to surveil and suppress foreign students' social media activity, and you know what makes their warning so devastatingly prescient? This is happening right as the US next year will host FIFA World Cup events, which are sure to draw fans from around the world, meaning we're about to subject potentially millions of ordinary soccer fans, families with children, people coming to celebrate the beautiful game, to the most intrusive form of digital strip searching that any democratic nation has ever attempted at this scale. Picture this: a family from Germany, lifelong fans of their national team, planning their dream trip to watch the World Cup on American soil, now forced to hand over half a decade of their digital lives, forced to make public every private message, every family photo, every political opinion they've expressed, all so that Trump administration officials can comb through their Instagram posts looking for thought crimes. And here's the part that should make every single person who cares about freedom of expression absolutely livid. A separate cable directed embassies and consulates to vet applicants for hostile attitudes towards our citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles, which is such a breathtakingly vague standard that it essentially gives immigration officials unlimited discretion to deny entry to anyone whose politics they don't like. Hostile attitudes toward our government? You mean like the kind of criticism that forms the bedrock of democratic discourse? You mean like questioning military intervention, or critiquing economic policy, or expressing solidarity with marginalized communities? Specifically, consulates are instructed to identify applicants who bear hostile attitudes towards our citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles, who advocate for, aid, or support designated terrorists and other threats to U.S. This isn't national security vetting. This is ideological purification. This is the construction of an information age iron curtain, where only those who pledge allegiance to a narrow conception of American exceptionalism are granted passage. The scope of what's happening right now cannot be overstated, because since Trump returned to office, more than 6,000 F-1 visas have been revoked in a matter of months, and the State Department has also sought to revoke visas for people in the U.S. who have protested about the war in Gaza. Let that sink in. People who exercised their fundamental right to political expression, who showed up to protests against a military campaign that has killed tens of thousands of civilians, are having their legal status in this country retroactively revoked, because the Trump administration has decided that certain forms of speech are incompatible with the privilege of studying or living in America. The State Department is instructing its staff to reject visa applications from people who worked on fact-checking, content moderation, or other activities the Trump administration considers censorship of American speech. The hypocrisy is so staggering it almost defies comprehension. An administration that claims to be fighting censorship is literally denying entry to people based on their professional work in media literacy and content moderation, turning the very concept of free expression into a weapon to be wielded against anyone who dares to question the official narrative. Now let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because the abstract horror of surveillance policy becomes infinitely more grotesque when you understand the human cost and the technological infrastructure being deployed to enforce it. From social media surveillance to facial recognition, the administration is employing a variety of legacy technological tools and databases amassed during previous presidencies, but as the administration's deportation efforts accelerate, it seems these technologies might streamline its goals and also become more powerful with artificial intelligence. We're not just talking about immigration officers manually reviewing Facebook profiles, we're talking about citizenship and immigration services, where data flows freely among systems like the automatic targeting system to vet and monitor non-citizens and support immigration enforcement, including by scraping and analyzing publicly available social media information. Artificial intelligence systems scanning millions of social media posts, algorithmic risk assessments, determining who gets flagged for additional scrutiny based on opaque criteria that could include everything from the hashtags you use, to the accounts you follow, to the geographic location of your posts. And here's where the technological dystopia meets the human rights catastrophe, in ways that should horrify anyone with even a passing commitment to due process. An automated translation tool resulted in an individual erroneously being denied asylum because it misunderstood that she was seeking safety from parental abuse, literally translating that her perpetrator El Jefe was her boss rather than her father, and an individual from Brazil was detained for 6 months because of an incomplete asylum application, because the translation tool ICE used translated Belo Horizonte literally to beautiful horizon instead of identifying it as a city in which the applicant had lived. These aren't edge cases. These aren't unfortunate glitches in an otherwise functional system. These are the inevitable consequences of deploying error-prone automated systems to make life-altering decisions about human beings. Another automated system used to conduct content analysis mistranslated good morning in Arabic to attack them. Imagine having your entire future in this country, your career, your education, your family, determined by an algorithm that can't distinguish between a friendly greeting and a terrorist threat. The chilling effect of this surveillance regime is already radiating outward in ways that fundamentally undermine the very freedoms this country claims to champion. Individuals may self-censor, fearing repercussions for peaceful forms of government criticism, such as writing op-eds or participating in campus protests, and some universities have even advised international students to be cautious about their digital footprints. Think about what this means for academic freedom, for intellectual discourse, for the ability of scholars and students to engage in the kind of critical thinking that universities are supposed to foster. Censoring the speech of non-citizens on social media seems to be a purpose of this requirement, and the result is exactly what authoritarian regimes throughout history have sought to achieve: a population that polices its own thoughts, that internalizes the surveillance, that surrenders the freedom of expression before the government even has to explicitly demand it. Now here's where I want you to understand the full scope of what's being constructed, because this isn't just about immigration. This is about building the architecture of a surveillance state that will inevitably be turned inward against American citizens. The proposal would widen the government's social media surveillance dragnet to include not only travelers, visa applicants, and visa holders, but also their U.S. citizen contacts. Read that again. Your U.S. citizen contacts, which means that if you're an American and you're friends on social media with someone applying for a visa, your posts, your political opinions, your associations, all of that becomes part of the government's vetting process. By linking individuals' online presence to government databases, officials could more easily identify, monitor, and penalize people based on their online self-expression, raising the risk of self-censorship driven by fear of misinterpretation or adverse consequences. This is how authoritarian control metastasizes. This is how a policy ostensibly targeted at foreign nationals becomes a mechanism for surveilling everyone, and anyone who thinks this surveillance apparatus will remain confined to immigration enforcement is engaged in the most dangerous form of naivete. The bipartisan complicity in building this surveillance infrastructure demands our attention because while Trump is accelerating and weaponizing these systems with unprecedented brazenness, the foundation was laid over decades of Democratic and Republican administrations normalizing the expansion of state power. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have ushered in technologies that can help power immigration enforcement, and nearing the end of Biden's term, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security reported nearly 200 uses of AI across its departments, including approximately 20 active use cases by immigration and customs enforcements. This isn't about partisan point scoring. This is about recognizing that the surveillance state has been under construction for decades, with each administration adding new capabilities, new databases, new forms of monitoring, and what we're witnessing under Trump is the full weaponization of an apparatus that should never have been built in the first place. Aided by electronic monitoring and data mining companies that extract, aggregate, and sell personal information from tens of thousands of private and public digital databases without the consent of individuals, the Biden administration expanded the surveillance of immigrants to unprecedented levels. Below this spreading surveillance lies LexisNexis Risk Solutions, whose Accurate tool produces comprehensive dossiers with identifying information, court data, and details of relatives, associates, and social media usage of practically all U.S. residents. This is surveillance capitalism fused with state power in ways that obliterate any meaningful distinction between private data collection and government monitoring, and the profitability of this system ensures that corporate interests are now structurally aligned with the expansion of surveillance. But let's return to the immediate crisis, because while we're talking about structural issues and historical continuity, there are real human beings whose lives are being destroyed right now by these policies. Layering mandatory public social media exposure on top of that trend deepens concerns already raised by universities, civil liberties advocates, and immigration lawyers about the chilling effect of surveillance on lawful speech. The new State Department rule underscores how central social media and online activity have become to Trump-era immigration policy, with visa holders and applicants facing consequences for posts, affiliations, or protest activity that officials interpret as security or ideological risks. We're talking about international students who came to this country to pursue higher education, to contribute to research and innovation, to build lives and communities, now living in constant fear that a social media post from years ago, a retweet of a political message, a photo from a protest, could result in their visa being revoked and their entire future being destroyed. In March, USCIS announced plans to update application forms so officers could collect social media identifiers for all visa and citizenship applicants, saying the change was needed to comply with a Trump executive order on protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats. And by August, USCIS had gone further, announcing that anti-American activity would be weighed heavily against applicants for a wide range of immigration benefits, from temporary visa extensions to green cards and citizenship, as part of a new policy manual update that expands vetting procedures. Anti-American activity. Let's be absolutely clear about what this means. This is the government explicitly codifying ideological conformity as a prerequisite for immigration benefits. This is the state declaring that certain political opinions are un-American and therefore grounds for exclusion, and if you think this kind of political test will remain confined to immigration, you're not paying attention to how authoritarianism advances. The international implications of this surveillance regime should alarm anyone who understands the interconnected nature of global civil liberties, because when the United States implements these policies, which provides cover and encouragement for authoritarian regimes around the world to intensify their own surveillance and ideological policing. The U.S. was showing signs of undergoing a rapid authoritarian shift as civic freedoms in the country decline following President Donald Trump's return to the White House, and Civicus, an international network of civil society groups that advocates for stronger civil liberties, downgraded its assessment of U.S. civic freedoms from narrowed to obstructed. When international human rights organizations are placing the United States in the same category as countries with obstructed civic freedoms, when they're warning about a rapid authoritarian shift in American democracy, we need to recognize the severity of what's happening and the global implications of American decline into surveillance authoritarianism. Let's talk about the specific mechanisms of control being deployed, because understanding how this system operates is essential to resisting it. Under a 2018 Customs and Border Protection policy, U.S. border agents are authorized to inspect electronic devices carried by any traveler, regardless of citizenship, without a warrant or probable cause, and agents may examine phones, computers, and other devices to review posts and private messages on social media, even if they do not suspect any involvement in criminal activity or have immigration-related concerns. This is warrantless search and seizure at the border being normalized as standard procedure. This is the Fourth Amendment being treated as a suggestion rather than a constitutional guarantee, and the fact that this policy applies to anyone, including U.S. citizens, means that the border has become a constitution-free zone where fundamental rights simply don't apply. A March 2025 executive order directed at breaking down information sharing protections is likely to further facilitate expansive data sharing and consolidation between and within agencies, effectively lowering barriers to access and increasing the likelihood that social media information collected for a limited purpose will instead be recycled through the system. This is the architecture of total information awareness, being assembled piece by piece, where data collected ostensibly for one narrow purpose becomes available to every government agency for any purpose they can justify, where the walls between different types of surveillance dissolve until we're left with a comprehensive database of everyone's digital life accessible to whoever has the right clearance level. The connection between immigration enforcement and broader attacks on civil liberties has been made explicit by immigration officials themselves. Every day, the administration uses immigration enforcement as a template to violate and erode our rights and liberties. We're seeing the Trump administration really pursuing an attack on core democratic values and using immigration and immigrants as the battleground for that attack, attacking the right to free speech, the right to a fair day in court, these core American ideals, intentionally attacking those ideas by starting with the immigration system, by weaponizing immigration laws, by resurrecting old wartime authorities, by targeting non-citizens as the first line of attack on these rights. This is how authoritarianism advances. You start by targeting the most vulnerable, the people with the least political power to resist, and you use that as a testing ground for techniques and technologies that will eventually be deployed against everyone else. Now let's connect this to the broader context of Trump's second term, because this surveillance expansion is happening alongside the most aggressive immigration enforcement campaign in modern American history. In its bid to ramp up deportations, the Trump administration is granting ICE access to a swath of government databases that were previously off-limits for immigration enforcement, including sensitive tax and Social Security records, and this unprecedented data sharing has its roots in the post-9/11 era. The post-9/11 surveillance architecture, built under the pretext of counterterrorism, is now being fully weaponized for immigration enforcement, demonstrating exactly why civil libertarians were right to oppose these expansions of state power, even when they were sold as necessary for national security. Because once you build the surveillance infrastructure, it will inevitably be repurposed for whatever the current political priorities happen to be. The economic interests driving this surveillance expansion deserve scrutiny because there's a massive industry profiting from the surveillance of immigrants and the expansion of enforcement capabilities. While LexisNexis perpetuates fear in immigrant communities, its parent company, the British multinational RELX Group, headquartered in London, announced a 9% increase in revenues in 2022, and surveillance capitalism is driving the suppression and repression of free speech, protests, and the ability to speak out against abuses. These are multinational corporations extracting profit from human suffering, from the destruction of civil liberties, from the expansion of state surveillance, and the financial incentives ensure that there will always be powerful interests lobbying for more monitoring, more databases, more integration between private data collection and government enforcement. Let's talk about what resistance looks like, because despair is a luxury we cannot afford, and the stakes are too high to surrender to cynicism. The 60-day public comment period on this proposal is not merely a procedural formality, it's an opportunity for mass mobilization, for civil society organizations to flood the government with opposition, for ordinary people to make clear that we will not accept the normalization of surveillance authoritarianism. The U.S. public has 60 days to comment on the proposals, and every single person reading this needs to understand that this is a moment that demands action, that demands us to show up and be counted in opposition to policies that fundamentally undermine human dignity and freedom. The legal challenges to these policies are already mounting, because courts remain one of the few institutional checks on executive overreach. Civil liberties organizations are documenting abuses, filing lawsuits, demanding transparency through Freedom of Information Act requests, and these efforts are essential even when the judiciary has been compromised by partisan appointments, because legal resistance creates a record, establishes precedent, and sometimes, when justice prevails, actually blocks or rolls back authoritarian policies. First Amendment experts criticized the memo's guidance as itself a potential violation of free speech rights, and this policy is incoherent and unconstitutional. According to First Amendment scholars who understand that using immigration enforcement to suppress speech and punish political opinions is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy. The international dimension of this struggle cannot be ignored, because global solidarity is essential to resisting surveillance authoritarianism in an interconnected world. When the United States implements these policies, it affects not just Americans but people around the world, and building coalitions with international human rights organizations, with civil society groups in other countries, with transnational movements for digital rights and privacy, creates the possibility of coordinated resistance that transcends national borders and challenges the global expansion of surveillance capitalism. Universities and academic institutions have a particular responsibility here, because they are the gatekeepers for international students and scholars, and they need to be vocal in opposing policies that undermine academic freedom and create hostile environments for foreign students. The Trump administration has targeted international students at the elite university in a punitive move over the school's refusal to sufficiently capitulate to a list of demands, and the willingness to use international students as leverage to control universities demonstrates exactly how immigration enforcement is being weaponized against higher education institutions that refuse to surrender their independence. The technological resistance to surveillance is also crucial, because while government agencies are deploying increasingly sophisticated monitoring systems, privacy advocates and technologists are developing tools and strategies to protect digital security and resist surveillance. Encryption, secure communication platforms, privacy-protecting browsers, and digital security training for vulnerable communities all represent forms of resistance that make surveillance more difficult and expensive, that create spaces of privacy within the panopticon, that preserve the possibility of dissent even under conditions of pervasive monitoring. Let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because this isn't just about immigration policy. This is about the kind of society we're going to be. This is about whether we're going to accept the normalization of ideological screening and political loyalty tests. This is about whether we're going to allow the government to construct a comprehensive surveillance apparatus that monitors every aspect of our digital lives. According to the Brennan Center of Justice, the Trump administration is planning to gather social media identifiers of more than 33 million people, including those applying for permanent residence or adjustment of their immigration status. 33 million people. That's not a targeted security measure, that's mass surveillance on a scale that should be unconscionable in any society that calls itself free. The historical parallels are unavoidable and instructive, because authoritarian regimes throughout history have used similar techniques of ideological screening and political exclusion to consolidate power and suppress dissent. By restricting travel, authoritarian regimes inhibit civil liberties, and by suppressing civil liberties, these regimes buy themselves stability. The logic is ancient and brutal. Control who can move, control what people can say, create fear of the consequences of dissent, and you create a population that is easier to govern through intimidation rather than consent. The ultimate question we need to confront is whether we're going to resist this trajectory toward surveillance authoritarianism with the same moral urgency and political commitment that the moment demands. The Trump administration is moving fast, implementing policies at a pace designed to overwhelm opposition, to create so many simultaneous crises that resistance becomes fragmented and exhausted. But this is precisely why coordination, sustained mobilization, and strategic focus on key battles like this surveillance expansion are essential. This is not a drill. This is not hyperbole. This is a genuine authoritarian shift being documented by international human rights organizations, opposed by civil liberties advocates, and experienced as terror and trauma by millions of people whose lives are being destroyed by these policies. The World Cup becomes, in this context, not just a sporting event, but a testing ground for mass surveillance, an opportunity for the Trump administration to normalize the most intrusive forms of digital monitoring on an unprecedented scale, to demonstrate to the world that entry to the United States now requires surrendering your digital privacy and submitting to ideological vetting. And if we allow this to happen, if we accept that millions of soccer fans should be subjected to 5 years of social media review just to watch a game, then we've conceded the fundamental principle that privacy and freedom of expression are rights rather than privileges to be granted or withheld based on political conformity. So here's what needs to happen right now, today, this moment. Comment on the proposal, support civil liberties organizations fighting these policies, pressure elected representatives to oppose surveillance expansion, build coalitions with impacted communities, document abuses, file lawsuits, organize protests, educate others about what's happening, and refuse to accept the normalization of authoritarian control. Because if we don't resist this now, if we don't draw a line and say that this surveillance apparatus is unacceptable in a free society, then we surrender not just our own freedoms, but the freedoms of everyone who comes after us, and we become complicit in the construction of a surveillance state that will take generations to dismantle if it can be dismantled at all. The choice is ours, the moment is now, and history will judge us by whether we rose to meet this crisis with the courage and conviction it demands.